Good afternoon, thanks all for being here. My name's Denise Matthews, I'm the Chapter Director of Startup Grind Gibraltar, founder of One Media and Events, and Operations Manager of the GSX Blockchain Innovation Centre. So tonight we're going to talk about e-gaming and Brexit with two wonderful guests that I really appreciate have agreed to be with us. Just can tell you a little bit about them. Elicia Bravo is the Chief Strategy Officer of Lottoland. She has over 7 years of international finance legal experience, representing corporate, sovereigns, and top-tier investment banks in a variety of multi-jurisdictional debt and equity-linked transactions. After a BA in law at Oxford University, Elicia went on to qualify as both a UK and New York lawyer, and she has also completed an MBA at INSEAD, which is consistently ranked among the best business schools in the world. And we have Peter Montegriffo, I'm sure nobody knows him, was Gibraltar's Minister for Trade and Industry with responsibility for economic development and financial services between May 1996 and February 2000. Having graduated from Leeds University, Peter attended the Inns of Court School of Law as a member of Lincoln Inns. Peter qualified as a barrister in 1982, becoming a partner of Hassans in 1988. And on 12th of June 2014, Peter was appointed as Queen's Counsel in Gibraltar. He is a member of the preeminent global gambling law, networking and educational organization. International Masters of Gaming Law, IMGL, is at the forefront of the latest developments in international gambling law. Phew, jeez, you guys have a CV. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. So, okay, I'm going to start with you, Elicia. And I wanted you to tell us a little bit more about your academic background, because obviously you have qualified in the US, you went to further your studies with an MBA. Do you think this contributed to having a more open-minded approach to your career?
I think, yeah. I think without a doubt, of course, the fact that I was exposed to numerous countries, both as a professional and as a student, meant that I learned from a lot of different cultures, not only in the day-to-day, but
Sure.
also in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
I think having started off as a finance lawyer and then moving into more the business world and developing a whole new broad set of business skills has really helped me become both a better professional and actually a better lawyer, and has also opened many doors, including the gaming industry in Gibraltar, which is something I'd never really entered up until a few years ago.
Peter, let's hear a bit from you. So aside from a legal and political career, you are also actively involved with university, finance centre and gaming. So was this something you always had a calling for?
Well, I'm not sure that I always had a calling for, but the view I've always taken about what I like to do in Gibraltar is that I've never regarded what I do as just being what a lawyer does or what a professional does for the client. I've always thought of Gibraltar PLC as an important, indeed as important, a priority as the client, because the client's interests, in my view, usually go with Gibraltar PLC's interests. And in a small place like Gibraltar, it happens everywhere, but more in a small place like Gibraltar, we really are in this together. And nowadays that's easier to understand, because I think nowadays people are more collaborative and are more collegiate. But when I started in practice, which was several decades ago, that wasn't the norm. The norm was that most firms, legal firms, accountancy firms, even gaming companies and others, were very jealous of what they knew. There wasn't a culture of sharing and of growing things together. That was actually something that's emerged more recently. But my interest in contributing more broadly is based purely from the fact that unless we contribute beyond our narrow interest, the place won't create the environment we need for everybody to succeed.
Okay. So back with Elicia. Have you encountered any stumbling blocks throughout your career, or felt that you had to prove yourself harder because of the fact that you're a woman?
I think probably in the earlier years, it was fair to say I did. I think the City of London was a very different place when I started there, now probably 10 years ago. Nonetheless, I've probably been very lucky. I've always had extremely supportive mentors and managers. And it's thanks to that, really, that I've been able to probably get to where I am. I think my personal opinion is that right now it's actually quite advantageous to be a woman, because luckily most industries are quite focused in the gender gap and trying to address that. And the City of London in particular, without a doubt, has really made huge advances in terms of the gender gap, without a doubt in particular industries more than others. I always like telling the anecdote of an ex-colleague and boss of mine who won in the last year potentially 10 awards for all sorts of things, and I congratulated her for the 10th time, and she said, you know, I'm beginning to be a bit embarrassed. I don't know if it's because I'm a woman or because I'm genuinely good. And so there, for better or for worse, there is a bit of a tendency now to question whether it is because you're a woman or because you're good. On the other hand, it does show that industries are trying to address this gender gap and continue to empower women. I think it's still a very difficult subject, still a lot of work to be done, but at least we're thinking about it.
That's good news. So, Peter, let's be a little bit controversial here, or lots, I don't mind. You almost became Chief Minister, and to many, that has been a greatly missed opportunity for Gibraltar. What are your thoughts, and would you ever consider returning to politics?
Well, I never believe that you go backwards. You always have to go forward, which doesn't mean you can't go forward into politics, but you can't go back. You have to move forward. And my current priority is to work with the government of the day. I worked very closely with the government after I left politics in 2000, which was still when the gaming industry was very nascent. You know, 2000, there weren't very many gaming operators in Gibraltar. I worked very successfully with that government. I tried to work very successfully with this government. So my focus is on really, I'm going back to my comment on Gibraltar PLC. I happen to believe that there is much more that unites us than actually divides us. The political process in Gibraltar is often quite combative, as we know, and I think differences can often be exaggerated for the purpose of effect, for the purpose of theatre, rather than for the purpose of actually advancing the needs of the community. So I think that my time is best employed in helping the collective effort. Thank you.
So, Elicia, let's talk a little bit about Lottoland as a startup and the huge success it has achieved over the period of about 5 years. I think you were just in the Guinness Book of Records also. What is the model of Lottoland, and what have some of the major milestones been for the company?
So I think one of the interesting things about Lottoland is the space with which it's in, which is the lottery space. We all know someone who's played the lottery, but I think I, at least, and in a lot of cases, a lot of people don't realize how huge this market is. It's approximately a $300 billion market that is like 11 times the taxi and limousine market. So we all hear about Uber and how big and the potential it has or had. And so the lottery space is huge. And there's only really a handful of players in that space, and the product that they're offering is a product that has been the same for hundreds of years. I mean, my grandfather used to run a lottery shop back in the day, and I'm sure he was doing pretty much the same thing as people who run lottery shops now. So it's a mass market, and it's a product that hasn't changed in years. So what Lottoland did when it started in 2013 was it offers people the opportunity to place a bet on the outcome of a lottery. So just like you place a bet on the outcome of a football match, you can bet on which are going to be the winning numbers of the lottery. Now, why would people come and play at Lottoland? Well, we've got a great online experience, huge variety of products. You're no longer restricted to the two national lotteries. You've got a whole broad range of products. We're making them more fun, more interactive by having add-ons, and it's mobile, which is what people want nowadays. So I think the main reason why I came back to Gibraltar, although it was without a doubt something that had always been on my mind, I think it's a great place to develop one's career. I hadn't had the opportunity up until then, was to join Lottoland because of the unbelievable success story it has been to date, actually. So far we've had over 8 million customers. We've paid out over 300 million in winnings. We're in 15 different markets. Our growth has been exponential. We've had zero investments to date, which is actually extremely unique for a startup, and we've been profitable from day one. Those two factors are rarely ever found in one company. So it's genuinely a fantastic story, primarily due to the team here, which is very dynamic, very creative, and extremely good at what they do. So it's been an honor to be a part of it and a part of the story of Lottoland to date.
That's a great story. What's the likelihood of a small place like Gibraltar generating a startup like that? It gives us a lot of hope, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Gibraltar had a lot of foresight in accepting Lottoland into this microclimate. Lottoland isn't your typical gaming company, especially not for a place like Gibraltar. Gibraltar has very much positioned itself as a blue chip company and has set the highest of standards from a gaming perspective, and I think it's done that extremely well and has marketed itself extremely well in implementing that.
Yeah.
So we were really almost an anomaly insofar as we didn't have a track record, but they saw a very strong management team and a very strong business plan, and a very interesting market, and have supported us and helped us in growing within this regulated environment. So it's been very good so far.
So congratulations. You're doing a
To
great
the
job.
team, not to me.
Well, to the whole of the team. So this brings me back to you, Peter, because you were at the forefront of the first gaming companies and their incorporations into Gibraltar. I'd like to know a little bit more about how that came about, because these were or are the global giants we know today.
Okay, so the internet gaming internet industry in Gibraltar obviously started, maybe you probably know this, with the arrival in Gibraltar of telephone betting operators. So essentially in the late 90s, you had Ladbrokes and Victor come to Gibraltar really to do betting on telephone betting. And this was very largely tax-driven. The rates in the UK were high, and at the time they thought Gibraltar was a convenient place they could relocate. And in fact, the government of the day gave one of these companies an exclusivity. Such was the sort of, how nascent and how keen they were to get just a foothold, an exclusivity, which of course then had to eventually fall away. But internet gaming, of course, only happened around 2000. And it's very interesting because Elicia's talked about Lottoland being slightly atypical, which is absolutely correct, because the attitude taken by Gibraltar from the very beginning was not to have quantity over quality. Gibraltar never wanted to attract the very large number of gaming internet companies that were out there wanting a foothold. We did not want startups. We did not want new businesses. We wanted businesses that had an established track record. And of course, you might ask, well, how was that possible in the context of internet gaming, because everything was so new? Who had a track record? And of course, the point is the businesses that came here initially, and primarily 888 and Party Gaming are the two examples I use, they were very cash rich. Both these companies were based in Antigua in one case, in the case of 888, in Dominican Republic in the case of Party Gaming. They'd only be around for a couple of years, 3 or 4 years, but they were huge in cash terms, and they were also actually quite developed as corporate entities. Fine, they didn't have governance levels like you need for a listed company, but they had boards, they had committees, they had structures which are very different to what you now see with some of the new economy, some of the new technology, where even the basics are missing. So when Gibraltar accommodated the likes of these companies, there was a track record of liquidity and of governance. And why Gibraltar? Well, because they were doing so well that they wanted a listing in London, they wanted to basically cash in, the founders wanted to cash in, and they wanted a reputable jurisdiction from which to do this, and they felt that being out in the Caribbean or wasn't going to be good enough. So it was a beauty parade. I remember very well that the sort of 2001, 2002, it literally was Gibraltar, again, Malta and the Isle of Man, and Gibraltar won out for different reasons, all right, we can go into those if you wish, and Gibraltar, once it landed 888 and party gaming, then there was simply the momentum that comes from getting those big players in. And of course, the fact that they successfully floated, I remember that when party gaming floated in London, its capitalization was bigger than British Airways. I mean, it was the biggest flotation that had taken place, I think, in the previous 2 years. I mean, this was enormous. And for Gibraltar to actually pull this off as a jurisdiction from a regulatory point of view and from a legal point of view, I must tell you, we were all learning pretty quickly, all right, was quite staggering. I remember that I led the two teams of an 888 and party because they wanted Hassans on both sides, even though that they were racing to get to the market first. And Freshfields in London was acting for both sides too, on a Chinese wall basis. And the two companies were wanting to be the first. Party got there first, and 888 shortly after. And then the rest is history, as they say. But as I've been commenting to one or two people here in the audience, not because we had that success did we then open the floodgates. As many of you know, we're still only 30-odd operators in Gibraltar. We said no, by we I mean both the government, during my time in government and thereafter as a jurisdiction, to hundreds of operators, not dozens, hundreds of operators that have ended up in Malta or in Isle of Man, including some very large ones that we didn't take in Gibraltar because we didn't want to be too big. Gibraltar wanted to pace its growth so it wouldn't be too offensive or wouldn't come within the sights of those who might want to then stifle and dampen the success. So sometimes you just have to have a little measure in how things are grown, because if you overextend yourself, then even if you do things right, you may create tensions or unintended consequences that are not desirable. So it was a very exciting time, and obviously created a completely new industry and brought to Gibraltar in particular skills that we didn't have. And I think one of the reasons for Gibraltar's success is that we have always been very accommodating to outside skill. Gibraltar recognizes that although we can be facilitators in a new industry, we need to allow people to come in, and I think we did that very successfully with gaming.
So on that note, how do you feel it contributed to the economic development?
I mean, I think it was completely transformational. I know an overused word, but I do think that there are few things in the last 40 years of Gibraltar's history that have been as transformational as the internet gaming industry. And not just because it's, it's not just the sort of how Gibraltar had accommodated a completely new strand to the economy, but I think the way Gibraltar was propelled internationally, it was, apart from the area perhaps of military significance, where Gibraltar is iconic in its military role in the world, I think you've got to really scratch your head to think of something equivalent to that in modern, last 100 years. Okay. And Gibraltar has become the premier centre, and we see people being prepared to pay a premium to be here. And of course, then I also think it has changed the sociological makeup of Gibraltar to our benefit. Here we are sitting at a time when immigration and outside influences seem to be so much under scrutiny and lamented by some. And Gibraltar is a great example of how you can marshal talent and have an open and welcoming attitude. And I think that's rebounded to our benefit.
Okay. So, Elicia, how have you found the gaming industry to evolve? And does Gibraltar cater well to this type of business and other startup industries?
So I think there's a lot of overlap with what Peter was just saying. As we said, I think the gaming industry in Gibraltar has come a very long way. Sure. It's positioned itself exceptionally well as a blue chip market, and in the global industry it's raised its profile to an unbelievable extent. In terms of the startup world, I think it's still in its early days. There's less than a handful, significantly less than a handful of startups in the gaming industry in Gibraltar. But the fact that there is a few within a jurisdiction where there's less than 30 operators demonstrates that actually the regulator is considering this and is open to it, provided it's the right type of startup. And I think that's actually the right approach. You wouldn't want to suddenly open the floodgates and start allowing all startups. I think it's correct to support startups, but it needs to be the right type of startups, because you don't want all the goodwill that you have built up over years as a jurisdiction that make Gibraltar the key jurisdiction, I think, from a gaming perspective, to suddenly be eroded by having the wrong type of startups. And Gibraltar as a jurisdiction, I think, is fantastic at accommodating gaming companies. I think we often get asked, why are you there? And to me, it's a no-brainer. It's a jurisdiction that has extremely fair and clear regulation and a constant open dialogue with the regulator, which sounds stupid. You'd assume everyone would have that, but actually that is not something you find that easily. And having that open dialogue with the regulator, with your regulator, who determines how you can act and how you can operate, is totally key and a big game changer for the companies, I think, here in Gibraltar.
So, staying with you, what is your personal opinion of the startup industry itself, generally speaking?
So I think it's taken in parts. I think in Gibraltar, generally, there's a very entrepreneurial culture. At least that's what I've experienced growing up here. In terms of an ecosystem, I haven't really experienced a startup ecosystem as it is. There's a lot of very interesting and useful bodies, such as Startup Grind, that is trying to promote startups, but there's probably not one focal driving point. And it's not something that is maybe spoken about openly. I think there's definitely a lot of entrepreneurial talent and quality in Gibraltar, and there's some entrepreneurs that have done exceptionally well here. But there should probably be more encouragement of younger entrepreneurs and more of a forum where they can discuss and share ideas.
Interesting. So, Peter, you recently wrote an article about structuring ICOs. And, well, how do you think this new technology and Gibraltar's regulation of it will benefit businesses in general? And should there be regulation of this technology in gaming?
Okay, I'm not quite sure what you mean by the last question, but if it's the use of the blockchain in gaming, then of course there should be regulation of that. And I think that will come, and we can talk about the appetite that the regulator might have to accommodate blockchain and crypto and all sorts of other aspects into gaming. I mean, generally on the new technologies and sort of ICO, etc. I mean, clearly the technology is awesome and is going to be here across the strand of different multiple applications, and I don't think we can tell today where Gibraltar's particular niche is going to reveal itself, right? I think that the potential application of this industry, from the ICO fund industry right through to the use of the technology, is so wide that we can't end up doing everything. We'll end up doing a number of things and doing them hopefully well. My theory has always been that places like Gibraltar and Switzerland and Jersey, with these small places, can survive if we become centers of excellence for a few things, and we have to identify what those things of excellence might be. But in terms of the next stage, I think there are three things that come to mind about what we need to be doing. One is that we mustn't have a rush to the bottom. That's my view. I think there's a lot of competition out there. People say, oh, but Malta allows this and Cayman allows that. It's a mistake to rush to the bottom. You have got to maintain a level, attract the quality business, and not lose your nerve. That's the first thing, all right? Secondly, and I'm looking at David here, the industry has got to talk with a more coherent, united, fashion, in a more coherent, united fashion. I think there's a lot of energy out there, a lot of people doing a lot of things. It looks to me disjointed. It looks to me that there is a need to sort of simply have your feet land on the ground and to give this industry some shape in terms of its voice. Right? And then thirdly, going back to the ecosystem, I think this is different to gaming in one respect, which is that gaming, internet gaming, although it was new, it derived from an industry called gaming, which was very well established. We knew what gaming was, and actually the internet was simply one aspect of a gaming industry. Look, it's very different, but actually from a regulatory point of view, there were synergies, there were parallels, there were things you could relate to. This area is potentially very different. So here Gibraltar's attitude has got to be a little more open to novelty, a little more open to innovation, even though I've said you mustn't have a rush to the bottom, but on the other hand, you've got to have a different approach. And I think we need to spend some more money in creating this ecosystem. Whether you do that by creating a sovereign fund, whether you do that by actually looking at the government partnering with private sector and having incubator or accelerator facilities, I don't know. I think there are many elements, but I don't think you can just wait for it to happen. I think in Gibraltar we need to give some stimulus to this area. So it's got to be the robust regulation. It's got to be obviously, you know, you've got to be able to make sure that you don't have this race to the bottom, but you've got to also invest in creating that system. A lot of people, the young people, they're not going to just get into this unless there are facilities, unless there is an environment which actually makes it attractive. And I think we've got to find ways in marrying the public and the private sector initiatives so it actually produces that dynamic.
Well, I think that kind of leads us up to the key question of the evening, which is, how is Brexit going to affect all of this? And I think it's a question you both need to answer, because perhaps there is a part of the plan that is not yet in place, or that there's no strategy yet there because people are just sitting tight and waiting to see what happens. So I'd like to hear what you both feel on the subject.
So I think I'm going to give the answer I always give when I get asked about Brexit. And I was once talking to a regulator and asked him this precise question probably a year and a half ago. And I found his response very interesting and very useful insofar as responses to Brexit can be, which is generally not useful at all. So he started off by saying he felt there was 3 stages to Brexit. The first one was the chest beating, and that's when both parties are establishing their ground. And we were just about getting out of the chest beating phase at that stage. He said, then we'll enter the mud wrestling. And that's when it gets really dirty and everyone starts saying it's going to be hard Brexit and, you know, it's going to get really, really bad. And then he said, and then finally there'll be tea and compromise. So I'm currently waiting for the tea and compromise. It doesn't look like it's arriving anytime soon, given the recent deadline it appears will be missed. From my perspective, I think Gibraltar has proved itself to be an extremely agile jurisdiction and has always responded very quickly and very well to regulatory changes. And I think that's something that makes Gibraltar the place it is. And frankly, that's probably kudos to the politicians we've had to date, being very creative, very responsive, and always having a plan in place. From a Lottoland perspective, Gibraltar is our home and we have no intention of going anywhere, and we will not go anywhere. And we'll just find alternatives for those to service those markets that we can no longer service from here. So I don't believe it will have a huge impact on the gaming industry in Gibraltar.
Peter?
Well, I mean, I agree with Elicia. I think that, that's all very sensible comments. I would just add a few other thoughts. I mean, firstly, a client told me not so long ago when I mentioned Brexit, he says, look, you know, you guys for 300 years have dealt with external threats. If there is one community that is hardwired genetically to deal with adversity, it's you guys. So in this world full of adversity, and it's not just Brexit, there are many other threats and many other difficulties. If you had to pick a spot, certainly in Europe, which is geared to weather these things, I'll put my money on Gibraltar. It was an interesting observation from somebody externally who sees what we might take for granted. So I thought that was really quite interesting by way of reassuring us that we've been through difficult and challenging issues and we actually just have the knack of floating on the surface despite everything. Secondly, I do take some comfort from the fact that notwithstanding all the difficulties that London and Brussels are evidencing, etc., vis-a-vis the Spanish position, we get constant repetition from the Spanish politicians and the Spanish foreign minister that the Gibraltar deal is actually going to be the easiest and actually it's virtually in the bag, and that all things being equal, this is not going to be a problem. Now, of course, we can sometimes discount some of that, and we can sometimes therefore not want to take it at its face value, but let's just recognize the fact that the narrative coming out from Spain is actually as positive as you could wish in these circumstances, and that investors are clearly believing it. Because another thing is what's happening on the ground. On the ground, I see people all the time, clients all the time, continue to demonstrate their confidence in Gibraltar, putting to one side the fact that, of course, in theory, things could get calamitous, right? But that in practical terms, they're likely to actually work out fine. And I think it's very important. And finally, look, I am an optimist, so you must discount a little of what I say, but finally I do think that common sense will prevail. The interests of both the UK and the EU in not crashing out are huge. In fact, there was a piece written by, I think, the head of the Spanish tourism agency was in London last week, where he said what was obvious, which is that for Spain, a no-deal Brexit would be a calamity. That was his word. Britain is still the top tourist destination for Spain. And the notion that a British visitor would have a visa, wouldn't be able to rely on health care, would be a complete disaster. So common sense is likely to prevail. Actually, if I have one concern, it's not that common sense will not prevail between London and Brussels. I think the difficulty might be that the arithmetic in Parliament, by which I mean Westminster, might simply not add up. It might just be the case that the arithmetic there can't get to a majority. Now, again, common sense should prevail there. You would have thought that both Brexiteers and some part of the Labour Party that actually doesn't want crashing out, that wants, and not just to play politics, that it wants actually something reasonable, would eventually give Mrs May the majority she needs to get a sensible Brexit through. But that actually, in my mind, is a bigger question mark than the difficulty in Europe and London getting to a deal. But all in all, I think Gibraltar is well placed to survive and do well. You have to look at what people on the ground are feeling, and people, including in particular external investors, feel very bullish, and I think that counts for a lot. That, you know, we should take comfort and confidence from the message that's transmitting to us.
Great, so I still have a couple more questions, but we did have this deliberation about Q&A, and if at this stage there's anybody who'd like to ask either Peter or Elicia a question, either on this subject or any of the other things we've talked about before I wrap it up with the last couple of questions, this is the time. No? No? Great, question.
I'd be interested in your thoughts on the gaming community and the adoption or acceptance of cryptocurrencies moving forward. Is there any plans to adopt that in the future?
So, I mean, my experience, what I've heard, is that currently the regulator is not open or not considering that. I do believe that as a jurisdiction, it will end up looking to both crypto and blockchain as mechanisms for the gaming industry. But from my perspective, I think there's still a while to go before we get there.
Yes, I agree entirely with that. I mean, however you look at it, we are at a time of change, all right? You can't be in the European Union today and be out tomorrow without some impact, which means you have to stop and just see how you do things. I think that's potentially a positive, all right? I mean, I would rather not be in this position, but there is a silver lining to every situation. I think in the gaming industry, we have a legacy which is tremendous. We have got to reinvent the industry. We have got to make it adapt to modern circumstances, and that includes the use of this technology. I think the regulator is open to understanding. That's the first thing. We want to understand how this works, all right? And we want it to be disruptive, but positively disruptive. Because if what we mean by disruptive is we suddenly make unviable all those companies we have here, you would understand why we're not going to embrace that overnight. But I don't believe that's what's intended here. What's intended here is to make this business work better and more efficiently. And I think we will see this industry adopting that technology. It's unstoppable, and we have to do it with care, but it will happen.
Any other questions? No. Okay. So, Elicia, how do you think better opportunities could be created for a thriving startup environment, although Peter mentioned a few? And what would be your advice for those starting a business in Gibraltar?
I think I'll take the second bit first. I think, to be honest, I think we've probably discussed a lot of what could be done here in terms of, for example, an incubator, some type of government funding project. I think that probably covers it. In terms of people who are looking to get into a startup, my number one tip is talk to other people who have gone through that position before. I'm now trying to share my limited knowledge with friends who are looking to start up their own businesses, and it's fascinating. Despite Lottoland is now really no longer a startup given their sheer size, it's fascinating how many times the same patterns of behavior and issues are repeated. Sure. And how much you can learn from those people who've already gone through that experience. So number one, talk to people. Number two, believe in yourself. If you think you can do it, then give it a try, do it. There's very little to lose. And three, if you can, try and find yourself some type of mentor or somebody who can support you through the process, because it is, I think the startup world is a roller coaster. And some days it's amazing and some days it's tough. But it's definitely worth it for the amazing days.
Okay. So Peter, we'll wrap it up with you and the famous improvement question. So where are there rooms for improvement? What could we do better in Gibraltar?
Well, I think I probably anticipated some of that, and apologies if I did, but I mean, Gibraltar's doing very well in this area, and I think I'd like to commend the government for having put Gibraltar on the map early on in this. I think that was a very a good strategic position to take, but we've got to do things with care. And I think that what we need to do is make sure that regulation, when it comes out, is robust and that it's workable. And of course, now we want to see it sooner rather than later, but it's been a little delay, but we need the regulatory framework. I've talked about the industry trying to get itself together, but I go back to the idea of whether it needs some private-public partnership. I mean, I do think that in order to make this really an agenda that the community as a whole starts to have an involvement with, we've got to have the public-private sector working together in a more obvious way than is the case at present. And I think that requires some funding. I know that there are private sector initiatives, we know that, in accommodation, in shared workspaces. The private sector is responding to some of this need, but it needs some element of government support to give it shape. And certainly in the context of a post-Brexit world, where you need to redefine the jurisdiction. And given Gibraltar doesn't find it hard to spend money on many other things that are strategically less significant than something like a new industry of this type, the government should be partnering with the private sector to fund a incubator, accelerator type facility. We know how to do this. They exist in other parts of the world. You've just got to put some money into these things to show your initial commitment to it. And I think the place is crying out for something like that.
That's a great tip. I hope they listen and they take it on board. So I guess that whoever wants to speak to Peter and Elicia, they're going to be around for a little bit longer for our next networking session. But before we finish off, thank you both very much for agreeing to speak to me today. And also the team behind these events, I'd like to thank them for being with me every month. So there is Margaret, the co-director, who is over there. Oscar, Alsbeta, Andrea are volunteers who've been helping out today. Gateway Media, who's filming the event and it will be up on YouTube. Redefine, Carl, who's been doing the sound today. World Trade Center for the venue, and our sponsors who are Abacus and Gibraltar Finance, our partners GBX and the University of Gibraltar, but most of all our attendees. Thank you very much for coming.